I got here early today. It's only 5:19. Woohoo! Yay. Let's settle back and get to chapter 13 of Charles Dickens. Let's turn on some lights. Oh, I forgot to do that. I got these lights on. Got those on. Now let's turn these on. Get the little candle effect. A little flickering. Okay, now. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 13. Daniel Quilp of Tower Hill and Sampson Brass of Bevis Marks in the city of London, gentlemen, one of Her Majesty's attorneys of the courts of the King's Bench and Common Pleas at Westminster, and the solicitor of the High Courts of Chancery, slumbered on, unconscious and unsuspicious of any mischance, until a knocking on the street door, often repeated and gradually mounting up from a modest single rap to a perfect battery of knocks, fired in long discharges with a very short interval between, caused the said Daniel Quilp to struggle into a horizontal position and to stare at the ceiling with a drowsy indifference, betokening that he heard the noise and rather wondered at the same, and couldn't be at the trouble of bestowing any further thought upon the subject. As the knocking, however, instead of accommodating itself to his lazy state, increased in vigor and became more importunate, as if in earnest remonstrance against his falling asleep again, now that he had once opened his eyes, Daniel Quilp began by degrees to comprehend the possibility of there being somebody at the door. And thus he gradually came to recollect that it was Friday morning, and he had ordered Mrs. Quilp to be in waiting upon him at an early hour. Mr. Brass, after writhing about in a great many strange attitudes and often twisting his face and eyes into an expression like that which is usually produced by eating gooseberries very early in the season, was by this time awake also, seeing that Mr. Quilp invested himself in his everyday garments. He hastened to do the like, putting on his shoes before his stockings, and thrusting his legs into his coat sleeves, and making such other small mistakes in his toilet as are not common to those who dress in a hurry and labor under the agitation of having been suddenly roused. While the attorney was thus engaged, the dwarf was groping under the table, muttering desperate imprecations on himself and mankind in general, and all inanimate objects to boot, which suggested to Mr. Brass the question, "What's the matter?" "The key," said the dwarf, looking viciously about him. "The door key, that's the matter. Do you know anything of it?" "How should I know anything of it, sir?" returned Mr. Brass. "How should you know?" repeated Quilp with a sneer. "You're a nice lawyer, aren't you?" You're an idiot." Not caring to represent to the dwarf in his present humor that the loss of a key by another person could scarcely be said to affect his, Brass's, legal knowledge in any material degree, Mr. Brass humbly suggested that it must have been forgotten overnight and was doubtless at the moment in its native keyhole, notwithstanding that Mr. Quilp had, God, my eyes, I can't see y'all, a strong conviction to the contrary, Founded on his recollection of having carefully taken it out, he was fain to admit that this was possible, and therefore went grumbling to the door, where sure enough he found it. Now, just as Mr. Quilp laid his hand upon the lock, and saw with great astonishment that the fastenings were undone, the knocking came again with the most irritating violence, and the daylight, which had been shining through the keyhole, was intercepted on the outside by a human eye. The dwarf was very much exasperated, and wanted somebody to wreak his ill humor upon. Determined to dart out suddenly and favor Mrs. Quilp with a gentle acknowledgment of her attention in making that hideous uproar. With this view, he drew back the look very silently and softly, and opening the door all at once, pounced out upon the person on the other side, who, at that moment, raised the knocker for another application, and at whom the dwarf ran head first, throwing out his hands and feet together, and biting the air in the fullness of his malice. Biting the air. So far, however, from rushing upon somebody who offered no resistance and implored his mercy, Mr. Quilp was no sooner in the arms of the individual whom he had taken for his wife than he found himself complimented with 2 staggering blows on the head, and 2 more of the same quality in the chest, and closing with his assailant, such a shower of buffets rained down upon this person as sufficed to convince him that he was in skillful and experienced hands. Nothing daunted by this reception, he clung tight to his opponent, and bit and hammered away with such goodwill and heartiness that it was at least a couple of minutes before he was dislodged. Then, and not until then, Daniel Quilp found himself all flushed and disheveled in the middle of the street, with Mr. Swiveller performing a kind of dance around him, and requiring to know whether he wanted any more. "There's plenty more of it at the same shop," said Mr. Swiveller, by turns advancing and retreating in a threatening attitude. "A large and extensive assortment, always on hand. Country orders executed with promptitude and dispatch. Will you have a little more, sir? Don't say no if you'd rather not." "I thought it was somebody else," said Quilp, rubbing his shoulders. "Why didn't you say who you were?" "Why didn't you say who you were?" returned Dick, "instead of flying out of the house like a bedlamite." "It was you that knocked," said the dwarf, getting up with a short groan. "Was it?" "Yes, I'm the man," replied Dick. "That lady had begun when I came, but she knocked too soft, so I relieved her." As he said this, he pointed towards Mrs. Quilp, who stood trembling and at a little distance. Muttered the dwarf, darting an angry look at his wife. "I thought it was your fault. And you, sir, don't you know there has been somebody ill here that you knocked as if you'd beat the door down?" "Dame," answered Dick, "that's why I did it. I thought there was somebody dead here." And maybe it's supposed to be dame. It's D-A-M-M-E. "You came for some purpose, I suppose," said Quilp. "What is it you want?" I want to know how the old gentleman is," rejoined Mr. Swiveller, "and to hear from Nell herself, with whom I should like to have a little talk. I'm a friend of the family, sir, at least I'm the friend of one of the family, and that's the same thing." "You'd better walk in, then," said the dwarf. "Go on, sir, go on. Now, Mrs. Quilp, after you, ma'am." Mrs. Quilp hesitated, but Mr. Quilp insisted, and he was not a quarter of politeness, or by any means a matter of form, for she knew very well that her husband wished to enter the house in this order, that he might have a favorable opportunity of inflicting a few pinches on her arms, which were seldom free from impressions of his fingers in black and blue colors. Mr. Swiveller, who was not in the secret, was a little surprised to hear a suppressed scream. Suppressed scream, squeam. And looking around to see Mrs. Quilp following him with a sudden jerk, but he did not remark on these appearances and soon forgot them. "Now, Mrs. Quilp," said the dwarf when they had entered the shop, "go you upstairs, if you please, to Nellie's room and tell her that she's wanted." "You seem to make yourself at home here," said Dick, who was unacquainted with Mr. Quilp's authority. "I am at home, young gentleman," returned the dwarf. Dick was pondering what these words might mean, and still more what the presence of Mr. Brass might mean, when Mrs. Quilp came hurrying downstairs, declaring that the rooms above were empty. "Empty, you fool," said the dwarf. "I give you my word, Quilp," answered his trembling wife, "that I have been into every room, and there's not a soul in any of them." "And that," said Mr. Brass, clapping his hands once with an emphasis, "explains the mystery of the key." Quilp looked frowningly at him, and frowningly at Richard Swiveller, but received no enlightenment from any of them, hurried upstairs, whence he soon hurried down again, confirming the report which had already been made. "Then it's a strange way of going," he said, glancing at Swiveller. "Very strange not to communicate with me, who am such a close and intimate friend of his. He'll write to me, no doubt, or he'll bid Nellie write. Yes, that's what he'll do. Nellie's very fond of me, pretty Nell." Mr. Swiveller looked, as he was, all open-mouthed astonishment, still glancing furtively at him. Quilp turned to Mr. Brass and observed with assumed carelessness that this need not interfere with the removal of the goods. "For indeed," he added, "we knew they'd go away today, but not that they'd go early or so quietly, but they have their reasons. Where in the devil's name are they gone?" asked the wondering Dick. Quilp shook his head and pursed up his lips in a manner which implied that he knew very well, but was not at liberty to say. "And what," said Dick, looking at the confusion about him, "what do you mean by moving the goods?" "That I have brought 'em, sir," rejoined Quilp. "Eh? What then? Has the sly old fox made his fortune then, and gone to live in a tranquil cot in a placeful spot with a distant voice of the changing sea?" said Dick in great bewilderment, "keeping his place of retirement very close, that he may not shoot. Lord help." that he may not be visited too often by affectionate grandsons and their devoted friends, eh? Added the dwarf, rubbing his hands hard. I say nothing. But is this your meaning? Richard Swiveller was utterly aghast at this unexpected alteration of circumstances, which threatened the complete overthrow of the project in which he bore so conspicuous a part, and seemed to nip his prospects in the bud. Having only received from Frederick Trent, late on the previous night, information of the old man's illness, he had come upon a visit of condolence and inquiry to Nell. Prepared with the first installment of that long train of fascination which was to fire her heart at last. And here, when he had been thinking of all kinds of graceful and insinuating approaches, and meditating on the fearful retaliation which was slowly working against Sophie Wackles, here were Nell, the old man, and all the money gone, melted away, decamped, he knew not whither, as if with a foreknowledge of the scheme and resolution to defeat it in the very outset before a step was taken. In his secret heart, Daniel Crow was both surprised and troubled by the flight which had been made. It had not escaped his keen eye that some indispensable articles of clothing were gone with the furtives, and he marveled that the cause of proceeding might be in which he had so readily procured the concurrence of the child. It must not be supposed, or it would be a gross injustice to Mr. Quilp, that he was tortured by An easy arose from a misgiving that the old man had some sort of money which he had not suspected, and the idea of its escaping his clutches overwhelmed him with mortifications and self-reproach. Hang on a minute. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 more pages or so. So we'll stop there. Sorry, even early I'm going. And Lord, I wish I had some new glasses. Y'all be sweet, don't be ugly. Yarn Hookers is on. It's 5:36 and they came on at 5. Love y'all. Be sweet, don't be ugly. And Kelly comes on tonight. Kelly's Crochet Adventures. I want to say at 8. Love ya. Bye-bye.